Okay, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're delighted to present to you a partnership really between University College London, Giles Herdale Institute for the Global City Policing and the Canterbury Centre for Policing Research from Canterbury Christchurch University to host the series of seminars. This is the second one in the series. And as most people will be aware, there's all kinds of changes happening in criminal justice that are quite rapid, but none more than technology in terms of big data, algorithms, machine learning. And this is what the webinar will be focusing on. There's all kinds of challenges with this kind of evolving technology, and particularly human rights groups have criticised some programmes, particularly around concerns of racial profiling and discrimination. However, information is becoming more and more plentiful, and more challenges are presenting themselves in terms of disclosure and various issues in policing and criminal justice more broadly. So machine learning has been used successfully in quite a few industries, and we're starting to see some of those technologies applied in criminal justice to tackle some of the arising issues in terms of crime and information and how it's used in the criminal justice system. So we've got some excellent speakers today. We've got, first of all, starting off is Alexander Babuta, who will be talking about data analytics and algorithms in policing. Alexander is a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He's involved in a variety of different research projects, and will be presenting some of his work today. Following Alexander, we have Dr. Bennett Kleinberg, who will be talking on crime science becoming data science. Dr. Kleinberg is an assistant professor in the data science department of methodology and statistics at Tilburg University. Following Dr. Kleinberg, we'll have Andy Featherson, the detective superintendent from Kent Police, who will be discussing an evidence-based investigative tool. And he'll be joining us closer to his start time at 3 o'clock. And then finally, we have Giles Herdale, who is an independent expert working on digital investigation, and he'll be discussing his topic, which will be embedding data ethics in policing. So what we intend to do is have one talk after the other, and then at the end, which will be roughly 3:45, we'll open up for questions. So please feel free to use the question and answer a box in terms of presenting your questions, and we'll bring them together at the end. So without any further ado, Alexander, if we could bring you to the fore with your presentation, please.
Thank you, Steve. Quick sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. As Steve mentioned, I'm going to present the findings of some research that I've conducted over the last couple of years in my capacity as a research fellow at RUSI, but I've actually now left RUSI and I've taken up a new position at the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So I'm in a bit of a transition period at the moment. I'm just going to share my screen and crack on with my presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can now all see those slides. And just to give you some sort of context around this project. So a couple of years ago now, RUSI partnered with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation to carry out a research study looking at the use of data analytics and algorithms in policing in England and Wales. And the purpose of this review was to inform an ongoing project that the CDEI was conducting looking at algorithmic bias. So we had three broad objectives, really. First of all, to understand how new technologies like machine learning and AI were being used by police forces in England and Wales. Secondly, to identify the legal, ethical and policy challenges associated with the use of new and emerging AI technologies. And third, to make recommendations for new policy guidelines and processes governing the police's use of technology. And our findings were published in a report last year that made a series of recommendations directed at organisations like the NPCC, Home Office and College of Policing. So I'm just going to very briefly in the next 15 minutes or so summarise the key findings from that research. So first of all, just to summarize the scope of the technology that we were looking at, we were focusing primarily on predictive policing, and this falls into two categories. First of all, using historic data, police recorded data, to make predictions about where crime is likely to happen in the near future. So that's predictive crime mapping. And then secondly, individual risk assessment tools. So this is the use of statistical algorithms to identify the risk associated with individuals offending. And I'm going to briefly summarize those two use cases now. So first of all, predictive crime mapping. As all of you know, crime is not random. It's not randomly distributed in time and space, but it follows discernible trends and patterns. And one of the most consistent findings in the crime analysis literature is that repeat victimization accounts for a very large proportion of all crime. So if you're unlucky enough to be the victim of a burglary, the risk of your house being burgled again significantly increases for a short period of time, and then that risk decays over time. And that phenomenon is visually represented here in this graph. So we can see from the table at the top, if you look at the top left cell, this 6.33, what this represents is that after a house has been burgled, the risk of the same house being burgled again in the next 7-day period increases by a factor of more than 6. So once you've been burgled once, your risk of being burgled again is 6 times greater, and then that risk decays over time. But interestingly, the risk of near repeat victimization also increases significantly following an initial crime. So the risk of your neighbor being burgled, and in fact everyone on your street, that risk increases, and then that risk decays over time. So we can see from the graph at the bottom that the risk of burglary tends to spread across the street following the initial event. And this observation is consistent across pretty much all crime types that we look at, not just acquisitive crime like burglary and robbery, but also other forms of crime like violent crimes and assault. So what this means, this consistency or these trends, is that we're able to use past crime data to make quite powerful predictions about where crime is likely to happen in the near future. And many of you will be familiar with the concept of predictive policing. Now, this is a hotspot map, but this isn't a traditional hotspot map. It's not showing where crime has happened in the last 24 hours or week. It's forecasting boxes where crime is predicted to occur in the next 24-hour period. And this is based on analysis of historic data. So how this technology works, it's a form of statistical modeling called self-exciting point process modeling, but it's actually far more straightforward than it sounds. Essentially, this algorithm just uses 3 data points as its input variables: crime location, crime type, and date and time. And first of all, what the model does is it lays down a baseline level of what's essentially called baseline crime, looking at 5 years worth of historic data. But then it looks at recent data over the last 24 hours or 48 hours. And based on that analysis, it makes predictions about where crime is most likely to happen in the next 24-hour period. And these boxes are continuously updated as new data is added to the model. And this isn't on the slides, but field trials have found that the use of predictive mapping software is around 10 times more likely to predict the location of future crime than random patrolling. And it's more than twice as likely to predict the location of future crime than intelligence-led techniques, i.e. manually producing these hotspot boxes based on intelligence analysis. So there's been quite a lot of empirical research assessing the effectiveness of this technology, and the general consensus is that it is significantly more effective at identifying future crime than non-algorithmic methods. And this is just a summary of what I've said. So talking briefly now about the second type of predictive policing, which is individual risk assessment. So risk assessment is a core kind of concept in policing. Every police officer every day is involved in assessing risk. And when an individual is arrested or processed through the criminal justice system, assessing their level of risk is a main priority for the police and probation service. Traditionally, this process is essentially a manual process involving questions on a checklist. But using advanced analytics and machine learning, a few police forces in the UK have developed tools that assess the risk of individuals reoffending based on statistical analysis of historic data. So this is an example of a machine learning algorithm. It's a random forest forecasting model designed to assess the risk of an individual reoffending over the next 12-month period. This particular algorithm, this particular example is from Philadelphia, but I've got an example on the next slide of this technology being used in an English police force. And just to give you some idea of how this works, so we know based on analysis of historic data that there are certain risk factors that make it more likely that an individual is going to reoffend again in the future. There are statistical trends in that historic data. And we can then plug in those risk factors as input variables into our machine learning algorithm. So along the left-hand side here, we've got our input variables, things like age at first adult violent offence, years since most recent serious offence. And then at the end of it, you end up with a risk score, which is essentially a percentage probability or a likelihood of this individual reoffending again in the future. And I think one of the biggest kind of misconceptions around this technology is to do with the use of the term predictive policing, which can potentially be quite unhelpful. Because really, you're not actually predicting future risk associated with individuals. You're basically classifying individuals into different categories. It's a classification rather than a risk assessment. So we are looking at historic data and looking at the individual in front of us now and asking the question, to what extent is this individual similar to or typical to the data that we've got in our historic data set? And if the aspects of this individual are similar to those who have gone on to reoffend again, then they will fall into a higher risk category. That's not quite the same as predicting that somebody is going to commit a violent offence. And I think that's quite an important distinction when it comes to kind of law and ethics. So this is quite a complex machine learning model going on in the background. And this is what the police officer sees at the other end of it. So this is an example from Durham Constabulary, which implemented a tool called the Harm Assessment Risk Tool a couple of years ago to assess the risk of individuals reoffending in their force area. And the idea is that the output of the Harm Assessment Risk Tool will be used to assess individuals' eligibility to participate in an out-of-court disposal scheme called Checkpoint. So it's not used for making decisions over things like sentencing. It's used for quite a specific purpose, which is to assess the eligibility for individuals to participate in this out-of-court disposal scheme. And I think the important thing that I'm trying to emphasize here is that in the background, we've got some very complex advanced analytics going on, but what the officer sees at the end of it is essentially just a traffic light system, a high, medium or low risk. And it's very difficult for them to understand the factors that led to this risk prediction being made. Now, there are various kind of ethical and human rights issues that have been discussed at length in the academic literature. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and summarize all of them now, but I'm just going to focus on a couple of the most significant ones. One of them being the input variables that are used for this type of predictive tool, and whether or not they can inadvertently introduce elements of bias and discrimination. So there's been some quite interesting research that has shown that if you have size 10 feet, your risk of recidivism or reoffending is significantly greater. And the reason for this is that shoe size functions as a proxy variable for gender, because if you have size 10 feet, you're significantly more likely to be male than female, and males are significantly more likely to offend than females. But essentially, we can plug shoe size into a predictive model, and it will be a statistically significant predictor of reoffending. And the question now is, well, should it be included in the model? If you're Richard Burke in this photo, his answer would be yes. If other things are equal, shoe size is a useful predictor of recidivism, then it can be included as a predictor. Why shoe size matters is immaterial. But then you get into some quite difficult territory when thinking about variables like race or postcode. It's well documented that postcode can function as a proxy variable for race and ethnicity, which means that if we include location data as an input variable in these predictive models, they can overpredict particular minority groups or locations as posing an increased risk of offending. Now, it may well be the case that these locations experience a higher volume of crime, but when we plug that data into a predictive model, there's a risk that we create a feedback loop whereby particular communities or neighborhoods receive disproportionately large police attention. Therefore, there is more data gathered about those individuals or neighborhoods. Therefore, they are overrepresented in future data, and it creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where the predicted outcome is amplifying these underlying disparities in the input data. And this is probably the most contentious aspect of predictive policing systems. And this is why most of the tools that we see used in England and Wales, a lot of them will either omit location data, i.e. postcode data from the input variables, or there will be safeguards in place to try and eliminate any disparities in that input data set. And I think that there's another important point here, which is that all decision-making is biased. There is a large body of behavioral science research going back, decades into human decision-making and cognitive bias by the likes of Daniel Kahneman and others, that has found that, whenever a human being needs to make a decision or a judgment, there is a risk of bias. And if our algorithms are biased, that isn't necessarily a reason not to use them. The question has to be, well, is it any more or less biased than our current methods? Because obviously human beings introduce different biases to statistical models. Now, finally, I'm just going to pull out a few quotes here summarizing the key findings from our interviews with police officers across the country. So there's wide recognition that this technology could potentially greatly increase the ability of the police to effectively prioritize. Prioritization was the area where this was seen as offering the greatest benefit, particularly against the backdrop of increasing demand on the police service and the need to allocate limited resources to where they're most needed. So the use of predictive tools clearly can assist police forces to prioritize their resources to the areas of highest risk. But there was wide recognition of the potential risks of these tools, particularly around the evidence base underpinning their effectiveness, particularly with some of these new algorithmic technologies. We don't really have longitudinal validation studies that show that provide robust reassurances around things like statistical accuracy and margins of error. So there's a risk in this context that the technology is implemented without a full and thorough evaluation, which is why we need greater safeguards around how the technology is used. And these are just some quotes relating to bias. And essentially the main message from this slide is that there's wide recognition across the police service of the risk of bias and a strong desire to ensure that safeguards are in place to manage that risk. So last slide, just some of our key recommendations to manage those risks that I've very briefly touched on. So first of all, standard processes are needed across the police service for the way that these new technologies are designed, developed, trialed and deployed. There still isn't consistent guidance about how the police should actually trial new technologies or how it should be evaluated. So that's one of the recommendations, is that there's new guidance needed on how trials should be conducted and evaluated. And that the legal and ethical requirements should be considered at all stages of the project lifecycle, including ongoing tracking and mitigation of discrimination risk. So this means not just conducting an impact assessment at the beginning of a project, because the nature of machine learning algorithms is that the way that they operate changes and develops over time. So there are processes needed for ongoing review of these issues, including meaningful ethical review and oversight before a tool is deployed operationally. So essentially, the main overarching recommendation is that new national guidance is needed around how the police develop, trial and deploy advanced analytics tools, and this should include clearly articulating roles and responsibilities regarding scrutiny and oversight. We don't at all suggest that there is a gap in the law in this area, because there are various legal frameworks such as the Data Protection Act, the Human Rights Act, equality legislation, policing legislation, that governs how the police should use data and make decisions. But it's probably a matter of developing enhanced guidance to explain how those various legal frameworks relate to the use of new technologies and advanced analytics. So that's a very brief overview of the research, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations and answering questions a bit later. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Alexander, for that fascinating presentation. What we're going to do, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Just before I do, can I just remind people that this is being recorded and it will be available on the London University College UDI YouTube site. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Bennett Kleinberg. And then if I could just draw your attention to the question and answer chat box as well. So if there are any questions, we can bring them all together at the end of the webinar. So think about any questions you would like to ask any of our speakers, and we will compile them and bring them to the speakers at the end. So okay, thank you, Bennett. I'll pass on to you now. The floor is yours.
Okay, so now you should be able to hear me. So let me share that. Okay. Thanks everyone for taking the time, and thanks Steve and Paul and Ben for organizing this and giving me a chance to talk about what I think are important issues. My name is Bennett Kleinberg. I work at Tilburg University as assistant professor in data science. I'm also still affiliated to my old employer, University College London. And my work has really been on how we can use data science techniques, right? Working with large data sets and using computational methods to interrogate these data sets, to learn about crime-related questions. So what I would like to do in this talk, I would like to try to answer the question, will crime science eventually become data science? Well, first, and I'll keep this brief for the audience, because many of you know probably much more about this than I do, but why do we talk about crime science? Why do we even have something like crime science? Why do we not talk about criminology? And why do we pride ourselves in calling us crime scientists? Now, I think the easy way to explain this is we have these two axes. We have an axis that tells us about the kind of causes we want to attribute to crime problems, where we have very distant causes. So this could relate to education, injustice, inequality, and we have for approximate causes which could go as close to the crime problem as the situational factors in which a crime could happen. That's one axis, and then we have a vertical axis which ranges from reactive approaches, so a crime happens and then we do something about it, to the very proactive one where we ideally want to work with prevention. Now, and crime science, I think, can be located here on the top right corner, right? So a big chunk of what we do in crime science is about the proximate causes. This is why a big framework has been the situational approach to crime prevention, where we look at situational factors and see how we can change situational factors after we've understood them, how we can change them to then prevent crimes from happening. And this is why it's also located very much on the proactive side of things, that we say we rather want to prevent a crime than wait for crime to happen and then do something about it. Okay, so now what we've seen over the past few years, crime science has seen the entrance of data science. And I put data science here in quotation marks because I would say there is no such thing as data science, but for now, let's say, okay, data science enters and comes now onto the playing field of crime scientists. And it comes with a really big promise. The big promise is that the data scientists now add new dimensions to the analytical toolkit. So all of a sudden, we can do these big data analyses. We can work with computational models. We can look at, for example, text data. A big part of what data science is related to text data, but the same applies to, let's say, spatiotemporal data. We have big data sets at our disposal, so now we only needed the people and the techniques to do that. And this is what one of the promises of big database and data science analyses. What I also want to emphasize here is that the promise is also that it allows us to understand phenomena on two new scales, really. It's about two things. So one is we understand it at a much larger scale, where we can all of a sudden understand how do people feel about crime, for example, in the whole of the UK, right? We can all of a sudden we don't need to gather small samples anymore. We can access vast treasures of data. But the other dimension is that we can also look at problems on a much more granular level. Right? The moment you have a massive data set, we could zoom in and say, okay, but what about people that have just had a breakup and as a consequence are in financial problems, for example, right? So we have both this larger scale and granularity. That's one of the promises. So this all sells really nicely, right? So you can sell this, and companies make a lot of money with selling this kind of story. And then really it comes often down to, yeah, so you just hire the data scientist, someone that is good with computers, and then that person will solve all your problems. Right? And that has led to a situation which we're currently in, that we live in this anything goes Wild West data science scenario, where really you get away with everything that you do in data science, as long as it sounds cool and as long as there is large data sets involved in computational methods. What I want to do now for the next few minutes is I want to talk about what I see are the pitfalls of that trend. And after I've done that, I'd like to make suggestions on how we could overcome these pitfalls. So the first pitfall, I think, is that we're currently seeing a prediction obsession. Well, these computational approaches, and full disclosure here, I want them to succeed, right? I'm all for it. I think we should do this. We should do it in an ethical manner, which is often overlooked, but I'm very delighted to see the emphasis on the ethical issues in these talks here today. I want this to succeed, so I'm not all against it, right? This is, after all, my job in a way, and pays my salary. But I think there are problems. One of them is the prediction obsession. The prediction obsession simply means we have most problems around crime and security relate to this needle in a haystack issue, right? So we want to find that one potentially violent person among the many. This is an image of an artist who is really looking for the needle in the haystack in his performance. But I think it's problematic because if we only focus on that, we might actually work on a misguided mission. And the argument that I want to use here is the piranha argument put forward by famous statistician Andrew Gell-Mann. And he was saying there can be some large and predictable effects on behavior, but not a lot, because if there were, then these different effects would interfere with each other. And as a result, it would be hard to see any consistent effects of anything in observational data. So to summarize this, he is essentially saying that we are dealing with very small effects. Whenever we talk about problems related to human behavior, to social dynamics, it is always teeny tiny effects. And if we have small effects, that means it is not reasonable to expect that we can come with these can we solve these super difficult prediction tasks, like finding a needle in a haystack. And so I think by focusing on the prediction side of things only, not only do we sacrifice an understanding, which I'll talk about in a second, but we also focus on something which we may just not be able to solve. Second pitfall is what I think can be called a category confusion. What you often hear is, well, we can travel. Well, I always used to say we can travel to the moon and build self-driving cars, but I think the cooler one is now we can actually travel to Mars, right? So surely we can then also build or use computers that can. So if we can teach computers to learn complex things and even help us travel to Mars, surely we should also be able to teach computers or use computers, let's just keep it at that level, to identify who will commit a crime, to solve deception problems, right? Whether someone is telling you the truth in a police interview, for example, or not. We should surely be able to identify lone actors or future lone actors. Right? So, but I think that is a category mistake that we're making there, right? Because we are confusing rather simple to solve problems. It takes the example of self-driving cars. It's a simple problem, right? It is many simple problems which make it seem complex, but it is really simple problems we solve. We are solving essentially object recognition exercises. Is this a person or is this a lamppost, for example? But on the other hand, we have human behavior and we have social processes, which are complex problems. And here's a nice quote from a scientist working at the US office who's surveying earthquakes and ideally wanting to predict when earthquakes occur. And his quote is, I would not at all be surprised if earthquakes are just practically inherently unpredictable. Right? And if you read a book by Nate Silver about this issue, about why some predictions fail, or when many predictions fail, but some don't, you will learn from the book that actually we are now as accurate with earthquake prediction as we were 2,000 years ago. Right? So, but you say, well, how is that possible? We have all the computer power we want, right? We have everything 50 years ago, with everything we wanted. We have the computer power, we have smart scientists working on this. So surely it's just data and then you make the prediction. But it's a complex problem. The complex problems do not or are not as solvable as easy problems. Now, the third pitfall, assumptions. Now, in data science research, we have to make many assumptions, right? Assumptions could, for example, be that the way I behave on Twitter has some relationship to how I behave in the real world, right? Or that what I do on Twitter is actually how I would genuinely want to do it and not just me playing a role to signify to others how interested I am in controversial topics, for example, right? And we have to make these assumptions. That's fine if we would have evidence that it is okay to make these assumptions, right? But if you look closely, we really don't have that evidence. So we make these assumptions, but really we understand almost nothing about how online behavior manifests itself in offline behavior. Right? So that is more the holy grail kind of problems in extremism research right now, right? That we say, okay, how can we learn who or what someone is doing online manifests itself in what they do offline. Right? I want to know whether your extremist content that you post on some creepy forums online actually leads to you going to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., for example, right? But we don't really understand how that nexus from online to offline works. Another example is we have no idea really how cognitive processes, so that could even be that very basic process, such as me liking something, or me being afraid, or me holding strong attitudes towards something, how that manifests itself in language. But we use language all the time to study human behavior. If we use Twitter data, if we use posts on other social media platforms, so we really don't understand that. And so this comes down to a fundamental question of validity, right? Very problematic, and offer a solution or make a case on how we can solve this. Now, the fourth and last pitfall I want to mention here is, I think we see this research as envy, right? If you look at other areas of research, we see that research at universities is often, it's not exclusive in the exceptions, but it's often focusing on the fundamental aspects, right? So we focus on, let's say, how engines work, right? We want to understand this, and we want to maybe make engines more efficient, or maybe even move to completely new types of engines, right? But universities don't build cars, right? But at the same time, we see that this is happening in the data science field, right? Many researchers want to now make these nice applications, develop tools, and put them out there, right? And I think this is a kind of an envy of these, well, big four tech companies: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and you could count others, Twitter, etc., among them as too. Right? Where we say we also want to play in this game, right? We also want to develop cool things and put them out there, and maybe even make a lot of money with that. But I think that is wrong, right? Then you should work in the industry and shouldn't work at a university, right? There's a good reason why universities are not building cars. They would probably be very bad at it, right? And that's not their role. The role of universities is to ensure that there's a good fundamental, a good basis that others can work with. Now, these are the pitfalls, and now some ideas on how we can overcome them, what we can do about this. So the prediction obsession. How can we move away from that? I think what we really want is we want to make data science applications, or the use of data science for crime science or crime-related problems, and therefore I would keep it broader, social and behavioral problems. We want to make it truly relevant. And what I think you could slowly see emerging is a renaissance of social and behavioral science research methods. Right? They are very, very powerful research methods, right? And the social and behavioral scientists, they have been around before the computer was invented. So we have a good idea in social and behavioral science how we, for example, need to be very careful on what we measure, how we can isolate individual effects, right? How we need to be careful with our generalizations on which population we can generalize to, etc. Right? That has so far been largely ignored in data science approaches, but we see that slowly emerging. Slowly, people keep thinking, oh, there's this other thing called social and behavioral science, and maybe we should have a look at what they do. For crime science specifically, right, one of the things I think would be worth investigating or worth pursuing is, rather than focusing on predicting who will become a lone actor, or who will engage in or who will be a threat later on, I would say, why not build on that situational approach to crime prevention and just translate this to these large-scale approaches, right? If you figure out a way to, for example, extract situational attributes from large scale text data sets, you could fundamentally work on these theories and maybe develop new theories based on that approach. But you would then work on an understanding, right? We could work what's called process models. So where we understand how does one thing lead to another, right? Rather than just saying, yeah, there's just text data as input and there's an outcome. And I showed you, you get a sort of traffic light system that was presented very nicely in the talk just before. So I'll skip over the other things. That strange trend towards accuracy competition. That is essentially saying that many researchers compete for good accuracies now, and this is even incentivized in publishing papers, etc. But very problematic, right? Because thereby we fully sacrifice all kinds of understanding. So really, what I want to say here is, data science, just as data science needs these methods from social and behavioral science, the other way is true as well. So we can't see these two disciplines as isolated, and we can't just say, oh, the crime science problems are data science problems, so the data scientists should solve them. Now, talking about the category confusion or category mistake issue, I think the solution here is that we should just really be realistic and open about what we can do with data science. And someone working in data science with a really solid embedding, if you speak to people that work at universities, for example, they would say, yeah, it's really, really hard. Oftentimes people come to me and say, yeah, surely, so just run a machine learning model and then we can solve this, right? And it's that expectation management that is absolutely undervalued in how much time that takes, because you really have to say, well, maybe that works, but maybe not. And why would you expect that based on some text data, I can predict your behavior, right? So we really need to be more realistic. That's the core here. Now, given time, I'll speed up a bit. About the assumptions, and this is probably the most important one here, is I think if we want to have this sexy discipline of data science or embrace that sexy discipline of data science, we really have to take a step back and do what others would call the boring research, right? The testing assumptions, well, can you use text data or to measure how someone thinks about Donald Trump, for example, right? If we can, great, then let's do it. But if we don't know, what's your justification for using that, right? So really, I think we need to work what I think you could call the fundamentals of data science first, that we understand how we can use data science and then work towards the application. So really want to move to the bottom of that pyramid before we reach the top. And then the researcher's envy, that's something I'll come back to in a second when I summarize this. So will data science become crime science? I think it won't, and I hope it won't. And I think rather than asking the question, will data science become crime science, we should ask ourselves and hopefully answer different questions. And these different questions I'll put forward here, four questions. How serious are we with the science in data science and crime science? But if we really want this to be a scientific endeavor, then we have to work on the fundamentals of data science, right? And we have to accept and be skeptical that most signals are just small signals, right? And embrace the research method that can help us deal with that and can help us make solid conclusions. Second one is, how will we deal with theory? I think theory is absolutely undervalued in how we think about data science, and data scientists tend to ignore it. But theory saves us so much time. But if you have a good theory, you know where to look, right? And you don't just need to do this fishing expedition and look at all kinds of possible predictors of human behavior. You then know, well, actually, maybe I just need to look at this one. Though, how will the roads be divided? That's about the researchers. And I think we have to figure out as universities, what do we want? Do we want to be the active producer of products? Or do we just want to have an oversight role and call out snake oil that the industry is producing? Right? I think the latter is the more meaningful role for universities, because we can't produce these products ourselves. We need to be that sound of reason that offers a counterpart. Now, then the last thing I want to say, and then I'll finish, is how much do we care about understanding? That's another important question we want to ask. And we now see slowly how these automated models in all kinds of areas, how they fail. Right? We see that models that are supposed to predict whether a dog whether an image is a husky or wolf, is just paying attention whether there's whiteness in the background, right? It doesn't even pay attention to whether something is a wolf or a husky. It just says, yeah, well, if there's whiteness in the background, then or if there's snow in the background, then I think it's a husky in its natural habitat, right? So these kinds of things, and we now see that. But the problem is, if we do not care about understanding, and if the models become more and more complicated, we have no idea to figure out when or why a model fails. And if you apply that to the criminal justice domain, then we have a really big problem. On the horizon, what I think is good is we have that AlgoCare framework that many of you will know, where people say, well, if you want to use algorithms, then they should fulfill a couple of criteria, among which are that you need to understand it. So in summary, I think data science or crime science will not become data science, and the other way isn't true either. So data science must become its own discipline. Crime science will, whether we want it or not, adopt computational methods, and both disciplines should not forget their fundamental underpinnings. So with that, I'll close my talk, and I'm happy to take questions at the end in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Bennett. That was a really interesting talk, and thank you for that clear explanation of some of your work and some of your ideas. So we'll bring those questions to you at the end of the webinar. Yeah. Giles, are you happy to go next, please? And we'll start with yourself. So we're just going to change the order of the speakers slightly. So thank you, Giles, for coming into third place. Our third speaker will be joining us, but may have got held up. So we're just going to introduce Giles. So thanks, Giles, for coming in a bit earlier, and your talk on embedding ethics in policing. So we'll pass on to yourself, and when you're ready to start, please proceed.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for the invite to this session, and great to hear the remarks of Sasha and Bennett, which hopefully these remarks complement. I'd like to talk a bit about the ethical side of police use of technology, and we've heard about some of the technical challenges from the previous speakers, and what I'm really trying to root this within is a kind of concept around police legitimacy and the changing negotiation around policing by consent as a notion. So what I'd like to cover in this talk is a bit about what do we mean by policing by consent, and how is that evolving over time. A bit about the use of police technology being under the spotlight and some of the challenges that arise from that, some issues around developments within the sector and potential way forward for greater coherence and maturity in this field. Right, so hopefully you can all see that. Robert Peel, policing by consent. The Peel principles, even though, as we all know, there is some doubt as to whether Peel himself ever had anything to do with writing them down, but they have nonetheless become indelibly associated with him and have been described as the kind of foundation myth of British policing, the concept of the police being the public and the public being the police. Why is that relevant in an age of kind of data sharing? It really goes back to the fact that even at the outset, the advent of professional policing in the early 19th century, policing legitimacy was a very contested concept. There were plenty of people in 19th century Britain who thought a professional police force was a very bad idea and would be inherently a tool of repression by the state of the citizens. And so part of that framing of policing by consent was explicitly in response to that, to gain kind of public trust and confidence. And we've seen from the way in which that's been enshrined and exported, certainly around the kind of policing concepts that have been exported to British spheres of influence around the world. That's kind of become one of the most kind of enduring trademarks of the British policing model. But of course, it's not a static process, it's a constant renegotiation. And we've seen over the past 190 odd years that has come under test and challenge on repeated occasions. Clearly, in the current context, Black Lives Matter is a significant issue to kind of policing legitimacy in the UK and elsewhere, but it's not the first such challenge. We've seen similar challenges around the way in which policing became involved with industrial disputes in the 70s and 80s. Clearly, issues around the policing of public order, policing of communities. So this is not a static concept. It's one that is very much changing and evolving as society changes and evolves. and of course, the policing of those changing societies must keep pace with that. So in turn, policing is going through significant change, driven by the requirement to use more technology and more data. And this is both a kind of top-down and a bottom-up challenge. So we see operational challenges that are kind of pushing policing to use technology, things like changing offending patterns. We've seen a transformation in the nature of crime as a result of technology, to the extent where kind of volume crime has changed radically from the 80s and 90s, when acquisitive crimes were typically property-related burglaries and thefts of and from vehicles. We now see online crime, particularly fraud and other cyber and digitally enabled crimes, becoming kind of the predominant crime types. In turn, that's led to explosions in digital evidence. The volume of data that is now being amassed in the course of investigations has dramatically increased. And indeed, Dame Cressida Dick, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, gave an illustration of this in her lecture last year at RUSI, where she highlighted the difference between the volume of data that had been gathered in the aftermath of the 7/7 terrorist attacks in London in 2005, and the volume of data that had been gathered in response to the London Bridge terrorist attack in 2017, and how that had grown exponentially, despite the fact that in many ways the latter investigation was a much less complex network that was being looked into. So we see practical challenges coming from the changing nature of crime and investigations. But we also see some top-down drivers around austerity and wider automation. Clearly, everybody in this audience will be very familiar with the economic context for policing and criminal justice in the UK over the last 10 years, which has seen significant reductions in the overall expenditure in the sector, certainly up to 2018, 2019, followed by some more recent increases in that. But with that, given that the predominant cost base of policing is people, there's been a significant reduction in people, both officers and support staff across all police forces, and with that has come a drive to automate and digitize services in response to that. And we've seen that through statements from the likes of the Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Sir Tom Windsor, who's repeatedly urged police forces to up the scale and adoption of digital technology. We see that in statements such as the last Conservative Manifesto in 2019, making explicit claims around supporting police adoption of new technology, and indeed the use of increasingly perhaps controversial tools such as biometrics. So we have both kind of bottom-up and top-down drivers to support police adoption of technology. But with that driver comes challenges, and I'm just going to focus on three particular case studies over the last 12 months that have highlighted some of the perhaps pitfalls around police technology adoption, both legal and also perhaps ethical as well. Many people will be very familiar with the Bridges case that was brought in against South Wales Police. Bridges was a privacy campaigner in Cardiff who had the support of Liberty and other privacy and human rights organisations, and brought a test case against the South Wales trial of live facial recognition technology. This was a particular instance of facial recognition technology that was used overtly by South Wales Police in a widely publicised trial using fixed and mobile units such as the one seen in the picture. And it used a particular tool called AFR, Automated Facial Recognition Locate. And so the challenge was specifically against the legality of South Wales's use of that technology. That was originally went to the High Court, which upheld the police use of this. But then on appeal, the Court of Appeal found 3 grounds where it sided with the appeal, which were around the lawful basis for the use. The fact that there wasn't an explicit legal framework meant that there was too much discretion for policing in terms of the targeting of who was being subjected to facial recognition. Interestingly, this isn't really about the technology. This is about the police compilation and use of watch lists of people of interest to policing, an issue which we've seen come under scrutiny before in things like the case around the Metropolitan Police use of the gangs matrix. In addition, the court found that there were some deficiencies around the adequacy of the data protection impact assessment. So it wasn't that South Wales hadn't done this, but the court felt that that hadn't adequately looked at all the collateral intrusion issues that could be foreseen as a result of the public use of this technology in crowded places. And it also addressed specifically the issue of the public sector equality duty. Again, the court didn't make a judgment as to whether the technology was biased around protected characteristics under the Equalities Act, such as race or gender, but it made the point that South Wales Police couldn't show that they'd actually undertaken that assessment to ensure that they could be satisfied that it wasn't. So they didn't. I mean, interestingly, the court didn't find anything inherently objectionable about police use of facial recognition technology. They did accept the police argument that there was a public interest in using technology for wider public interest purposes. But clearly in this case, the outcome was that police use needed to be much more tightly bound and regulated than was the case at the time of the trial. And it's significant that the police and the Home Office haven't sought leave to appeal against that judgment. So effectively, they've accepted the judgment of the court and have said, yes, we want to use facial recognition, but we accept that it needs a tighter regulatory regime in place for that to be possible. Also last year, we had the report by the Information Commissioner's Office, and you see a picture of Elizabeth Denham there, the Information Commissioner, into the police use of mobile phone extraction technology. So these are the sort of kiosks that are widely used in policing to take data from phones that have been either seized under pace from suspects or have been volunteered by victims and witnesses in support of an investigation. And what that investigation, which was prompted itself by an inquiry by Privacy International, which contacted police forces about their use of technology, to find out if A, they were using this, and B, under what legal framework they were relying on for its use. It found widespread variations in police data extraction processes and practices. So effectively, there was a lack of guidance really about what proportionality of that data extraction and retention meant. The upshot of that was that the ICO found that there was excessive amounts of personal data being extracted without an appropriate basis, and that there was a lack of a clear rationale and justification for the necessity and proportionality of the processing, so both the extraction, examination, and retention of such data. And this report more or less coincided with a Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Beta James and Mohammed, which were two linked or separate cases, are both concerning appeals around data extraction from phones, which very much supported the argument that there was a duty on investigators to basically determine and define and record reasonable lines of inquiry in their reliance on digital evidence from phone downloads. And that's then reflected in some of the recommendations around the need for codes of practice to be developed, and importantly for tools to reinforce the data rights of subjects in their design and operation. So effectively, the tools should be prompting users to ask, is this proportionate, rather than just supporting downloading all the content regardless. So a significant kind of challenge really to what had kind of grown up as a sort of fairly default investigative tactic of accessing and downloading phone data. And then, of course, the pandemic has very much put policing under the spotlight, with unprecedented restrictions on individual liberty as a result of the various lockdown regimes, which of course could be the subject of an entirely, we could have a whole seminar on that subject alone. But it's interesting that a year ago, even the thought of the police using drones to enforce lockdown restrictions by effectively kind of shaming people who are out and about would have been more or less unthinkable, but we've seen that happen on numerous occasions. This particular case is from Derbyshire Police, whose use of drones to publicise people they regarded as being in breach of those restrictions was widely publicised and ultimately condemned as being disproportionate. But it highlights the fact that really there was a lack of clear frameworks for assessing the proportionality of the use of such technology. Technology clearly exists, police forces have access to it, they are using it, but how should they be forming judgments as to in what circumstances it's appropriate to do so? That brings us to the code of ethics, because it's not as if this is uncharted territory for policing. You could argue that policing, ethics has kind of been embedded in policing from the outset, going back to Peel and his statements. But the actual code of ethics, as it's currently defined, actually is a much more recent creation. It goes back only to 2014, and that code of ethics is issued by the College of Policing as effectively a secondary legislation, is in place, and indeed is widely used and acknowledged within policing, and is the basis indeed for the kind of police conduct and kind of discipline framework. So the code sets out standards of behaviour, but it very much focuses on the individual officer and the individual officer's conduct. And it's interesting that you see it described there, a code of practice with the principles and standards of professional behaviour. So it very much highlights that individual level of responsibility, rather than perhaps a kind of collective responsibility, as perhaps was envisaged in the kind of Pelian sort of language around policing by consent. And so whilst the code makes reference to a national decision model, and that's the diagram on the right of this slide, with the code of ethics at the heart, and that decision model again is in widespread use across policing as far as kind of operational and strategic decisions are concerned. It perhaps lacks some of the specificity to deal with some of the challenges that we've heard about today. That's not to say that there isn't good practice out there within the police service. We've already had reference to Algo Care and the evaluation of the Heart project. Both Sasha and Bennett have referred separately to that, and so that's been around for several years now, has been used as a framework to support police decision making, but it doesn't have any official basis. It's effectively there for adoption by police forces if they choose to do so. Some of them do, but by no means all. Of interest in relation to some of the recommendations that have been made by Sasha and others around independent oversight is the experience of the West Midlands Police and their Independent Ethics Committee, which has been running now for a couple of years, and has rigorously tested the use by West Midlands Police of data analytics tools and processes, and it's particularly interesting in that regard that is a really transparent process. That committee, all its deliberations and meeting notes are published. So effectively, it's an example of a police force really embracing the model of transparent oversight. West Midlands have had adverse criticism as a result of that in the media, but it's notable that both the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner for West Midlands are strongly of the view that this is the right way to go. But again, there's no requirement for police forces to go down this road. It's very much an individual decision for Chief Constables and Police and Crime Commissioners, and indeed, given that this West Midlands body is set up under the auspices of the Police and Crime Commissioner, it's entirely conceivable that if as a result of the forthcoming elections for PCC roles, a new Police and Crime Commissioner could come along and abolish that body altogether, or change its membership or terms of reference significantly. So it's not got any enduring statutory basis, certainly at this point in time. There is the UK Police Ethics Guidance Group, which is a body that's been brought together under the auspices of the National Police Chiefs Council, the NPCC, and that's currently chaired by Chief Constable Richard Lewis. And that coordinates the work of local force ethics bodies, not just looking at technology and data issues, but looking more generally at ethical challenges across policing, and trying to look at examples of common and good practice, and and so that body has been in existence for a number of years now, and very much recognises that they need to expand their role as far as oversight of technology is concerned. We've heard already about the work of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and the work it has been doing, looking at the use of, particularly the use of algorithms and machine learning in the policing and other public sector contexts, and making important recommendations around the mitigation of bias and disproportionality in the use of those tools. So we have sources of expertise out there, and again, there are lots of researchers. There's lots of really good academic work in this space, but the point is, as far as that is turned into practice, that's still quite a local decision for individual police forces, driven very much by local decisions around what they think is important or a priority. There is now recognition that there needs to be a more national approach. So last year we saw the first National Police Digital and Data Strategy published, and that's a joint strategy that's published by the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners and the National Police Chiefs Council. So that both encompasses the oversight bodies and also the operational leads for policing, and in that strategy there's a commitment to develop a national data ethics governance model, which is still an outstanding requirement under the strategy. Last year, the Police Chiefs Council agreed a paper around elements that should be incorporated into that governance model, around a clear national framework for data ethics. The role of independent oversight very much influenced by the experience of West Midlands and other forces such as Essex and the Metropolitan Police, which have themselves adopted independent oversight bodies. The requirement for cross-force coordination, effectively recognising that for policing's own sake, it needs to be better joined up around the deployment and use of technologies. If two forces are deploying similar technologies in different ways, and there's an obvious risk that they may come a cropper of different interpretations of issues around proportionality or necessity, for example. That better communication with the public around why policing is using technologies or not using technologies, and what the evaluation of that is, and education. We've heard from Bennett in particular around the issues of data science, but also importantly recognising that this needs to be something that police leaders are much more confident and versed in than they are currently. So it should be a kind of core requirement of police leaders, both operationally and strategically in future. So that's effectively a kind of overview about where things are at with UK policing and its use of technology and ethics at this point in time. I'm again very happy to take questions later on in the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. And that's three very complimentary papers. I'm sorry to say that our fourth speaker isn't able to join us at the moment. I suspect, as operational police officers, there's always a call on demand. So what we're going to do is go straight to questions now. And I've got some questions that I'm going to ask in the question and answer box, and another one that I've had as well. So we're going to ask them in order, but if anybody has any questions, if you can put them in the question and answer, and I'll try and put them to our speakers. So I'm going to do it in order. And I mean, this is for anybody to answer, but some have been directed to directed towards particular speakers. So if I direct a question to a speaker and anyone else wants to comment, please do. So the first question is to Alexander. So Alexander, the question was the efficiency of predictive policing, what was the efficiency of predictive policing as compared to reactive and investigative policing post-crime? So I think when you were talking about the difference between random patrol trial and those kinds of things, if there was any efficiency of the efficiency related to that, the reactive elements of investigative and reactive investigation.
Yeah, so quick answer is that it's extremely difficult to assess the effectiveness of crime prevention technologies, because when we're making forecasts or predictions about where crime is likely to happen in the future, typically we will put some kind of intervention in place that prevents that outcome from happening. Therefore, we've proved our prediction wrong. There's no way for us to know what would have happened had we not intervened. It's quite difficult to do randomized control trials in this context, because if you predict that somebody is likely to go and commit murder, it wouldn't really be ethical to say, well, we'll just leave this person in our control group and we'll wait to see if they do actually go and commit murder so that we can gather data and assess the effectiveness of our predictive algorithm. So essentially, you're left with retrospective validation, which basically assesses the extent to which your statistical model is effective when looking at historic data. Now, the field trials that have been done, looking at things like predictive policing, as I say, have come to the conclusion that it is significantly more likely to result in crime reduction in the area of deployment when compared to traditional reactive or retrospective approaches. That, you know, the notion of crime prevention it predates the use of statistical algorithms, and there's plenty of research that shows that proactive deployment in areas of higher risk not only leads to a reduction in crime in that area, but also what's called a diffusion of benefits, which means that the areas around the deployment area also experience reductions in crime rate due to this deterrence effect. So there's two beneficial elements. First, you're more likely to either detect or prevent a crime from happening, but also it deters offenders from that particular location. So it's difficult to do evaluation in this context, but the studies that have been done have shown quite positive results.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for Bennett. I'm wondering if you had any advice for managing expectations of people who have been misled about the current capabilities of these technologies. So I'm suspecting, you know, maybe some of the early adopters in using this technology perhaps would hope in doing it with more than they felt it has done.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I know that it sounds so easy if I say this, and I say, well, we have to be more critical, right? And we want to call out the snake oil that is out there on the market. But my advice would be this, and we have seen some police forces who really are leading in this and actually come to universities and say, oh, we have a company, for example, that says they have a product which solves a big problem for them, and they want to sell the product, obviously not make available or make transparent how the product works or how some algorithm behind it works, and really are just relying that the policers will buy it, will trust the company, and then they make money of it, essentially. And we have seen some police forces coming to universities, coming to me and colleagues, and said, well, could you have a look? This is this due diligence idea, right? They said, could you have a look and could you just help us make sense of this? Because I'm fully aware a police officer has other things on their mind than making these decisions about these tools, right? And police officers shouldn't have to make these decisions. And I'm also fully aware of the pressure that is on the police force, right? You can't just say, oh, well, we'll think about this a year and then come back to you and let you know. But this is where I think we can foster this collaboration between academics and people that want to use it, like the police, and say, well, okay, let academics also have that oversight role, right? Let them say, well, okay, we will critically evaluate this. And this could even go as far as saying, going back to the company and say, look, we have 2 or 3 people that want to do an independent evaluation of what you do. So please talk to them, share with them whatever they want to see, and they will then produce a report or recommendation to us. And based on that, we as a police force will make the decision on this. So I think that is a good approach to avoid that, because not everything that is out there is snake oil, right? But a lot of it is. And before, I mean, this is what many people in the audience know much better than I do, but oftentimes you get contracts that are then 10-year licenses for thousands of users, right? And then you spend millions on software which you don't know whether it works. The other thing is, in putting out these tenders, for example, for solving some problems, I think it is good to as a police force itself, have more realistic expectations, right? So not to say, oh, if somebody comes and says, oh, we have something that might be able to do this, we're not fully sure yet, so we want to try it out first before we really can tell you this is a thing that does the job. Maybe that's the better way to go down than going for a company that says, oh yeah, our tool is super accurate in identifying lone actors, right? Because I would say if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That's what I'd say.
I mean, is it something bigger than that? You know, in one sense, we talk about public service, in another sense, the private sector have got quite a lot of advances in these technologies, can be quite commercial driven in the marketed world they live in. You know, is this a sense of saying, well, actually, what we're seeing at this moment in time is potentially a pathway between our model of policing changing? You know, whilst there's been a craft of policing, the face-to-face neighbourhood policing and those kinds of things, actually our investigators are going to be more in line. They're going to have a different set of skills. They don't need to do fitness tests. They need to be technologically, strong. You know, perhaps we can't expect police services to have, their own research and development. So, but as someone's just said in the chat, you know, if they have their own data scientists as well, they've got their insiders who are expertise. So perhaps there's a kind of going to be a massive shift in the types of skills and abilities and the kind of people that need to be in police organizations to interact with this world.
Yeah, 100%. So maybe briefly adding to that, I fully agree. And I think down the line, the really, really good development would be if we see that what some police forces have, that they have their own data science team and that they build that, and ideally produce their own products, right? Produce what they need, right? Because someone embedded in the police, right, would say, yeah, but we want something that actually works, right? We don't just want to buy a black box thing, and they will know what they need in order to solve a problem, right? So I think that's a very, very good approach. The challenge, of course, with that is that data scientists are very expensive, right? So what I mean with this, and we see that as universities as well, that it is so hard to keep people that have the data science skills, to keep them at universities, because they just go into the industry sector, the private sector, and make a lot of money there, right? For them, there's a little incentive of staying at universities, going to the public sector and staying there. So I hope that this will change. And I think one of them, and without given time, not going into much detail here, but I think one of the changes we need to see for this to happen is, like you suggest, Steve, is also cultural change, right? That, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes here, but that the data scientists are not seen as the weird geeky guys sitting somewhere, right? But that they are taken seriously, right? That you say, well, these are people that can help us solve a problem, right? And if we get to that culture, then I think that will happen. But right now, the data scientists would say, why should I go work for the police if I make so much more money somewhere else? If I'm seeing there as this weird geeky guy, right? Yeah. So I think that will change.
Yeah.
And I think then we can solve some of these problems.
probably a few crossovers with the way analysts sometimes feel they could be used more as well. I've got a few questions for Giles now, and I'll kind of encapsulate them in one. So Giles, so thanks for those comments, Bennett. That's great, thank you. So Giles, there's a few questions. I'm going to put them together for you, really. The first one is, can legislation fit with emerging technologies, or is there this growing kind of democratic, gap between the deploying of new technologies? A lot what you're talking about in terms of legitimacy, and particularly in terms of the role of crime commissioners as well. Is this sufficient for public confidence? We've seen less independent crime commissioners, more political ones, but also is there a need for more independent oversight in terms of these technologies, and how far will some of these areas of guidance go? They can be different for Scotland to England and Wales, and how are these kind of ethical panels going to work? I mean, and I suppose in one respect, what these things are coming together to say is this new technology coming in place. Police are doing things in different ways. How are they going to be held to account, and how can we have something that is sustainable for the future? Because I suppose there's a danger that if those frameworks not in place, that this technology could be wield a great deal of power. It already is wielding a great deal of power. So you've probably seen some of those questions in the question and answer as well. So I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
So on the regulation of technology side and the related issue of oversight, it's a bit of a truism for anybody looking at regulation of technology to talk about the kind of lag between the pace of change in the technology sector and the pace of change in the law and case law in particular. And I don't realistically see anything fundamentally changing in that space. That gap's getting bigger rather than smaller at the moment. But that in turn means that there's quite a big grey area between what's technically possible and what is clearly legally licensed. Now, obviously, within a common law model, we have a kind of presumption, effectively, that things are permissible until they're not permitted, and so that's been relied on quite extensively in the British model to say, actually, we can push ahead and innovate and use technology even if we're not sure that it works particularly well, just because there isn't any prohibition on its use. But it does, I think, raise questions around oversight, and I think what some of the questions are getting at is a bit of an oversight deficit in this space, both internal oversight, so in terms of the kind of internal decision-making processes within policing being fit for purpose in terms of really challenging those questions about does this tool work? Does it do the things that we think it should do? Does it have problems associated with it that mean that its use is challenges our legitimacy? That's an internal leadership question as much as an external oversight question. But I think external oversight is interesting that police and crime commissioners, I don't think this was the problem police and crime commissioners were invented to address, but it's certainly been, there hasn't been a lot of examples of police and crime commissioners being very active in challenging this so far. It'd be interesting to see with the kind of forthcoming elections for PCCs whether there's any significant change there. I somehow doubt it. I'd somehow doubt this will be kind of top of the list of issues for PCCs to focus on at election time. But it does then raise a question around that sort of independent oversight and perhaps expert oversight, because as Bennett and others have highlighted, this is a multidisciplinary challenge. No, I don't think any one sector or any one group of experts has got the kind of monopoly of wisdom here. You definitely need a variety, and I think the experience of things like the West Midlands panel shows that you need to have both sort of lay and expert members to kind of ask the right sort of questions. You need both people with a level of technical knowledge and understanding, but also perhaps people with a background to look at issues around, say, community impacts or community perceptions. Above, it wouldn't be adequate to just have one speciality involved in this process. But I think where we're going towards is a need for more oversight and more transparency around the use of these kind of tools, because undoubtedly their use is going to grow.
Mm-hmm. And does that include the private sector? We saw G4S saying some of their data around the income they're receiving at the Olympics was commercially sensitive, and we've sometimes heard that kind of commentary. But what it does is it potentially means that you've got public service police officers having to provide full accounts, and then people in other sectors are kind of saying, well, some of this data is commercially sensitive, and there's certain limits there in terms of that transparency. And with the private sector likely to be more involved in these technologies, is that something you can see being overcome?
I mean, we can see more generally in society that regulation of tech, data protection, privacy issues have gone from being very niche concerns to ones that are now kind of mainstream issues. So I think there's going to be more focus on this, both not just from politicians and the media, but also from the public themselves. The public, there's not been a lot of public attitude surveys done in this space, but the ones that have do indicate that the public are much more aware about their own personal data, what happens to that data, and are asking more questions about whether there are appropriate safeguards in place. And I think that definitely applies to the police and public sector more generally, around, rather than just assuming that we're the good guys, therefore we can do what we like and people will thank us for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Giles. I'm putting some of these questions together, so forgive me if the order's a bit different. So I've got something for all the panel now, which you might want to pick particular bits out of it. There's some questions that are looking at technology and discretion. So one of them was one of the ones that was asked earlier. It says all the AI data science techniques and methods to become truly acceptable to the public, who have kind of impacted by the data-driven decisions, and it's important and necessary for these decisions to be auditable and available to the public. Is this happen? Current stop and search requires a constable to justify and explain. Is this being built into the data-driven decision practices? So that's one of the questions. Another one is, do you think Britain will ever accept facial recognition technologies due to the inherent inhuman wide net nature of them? And another one, how will officer discretion fit with this use of machine learning results? One will take precedent over the other on the grounds, as if it were. So that kind of technology that on the ground decision making, will that be superseded by the technology itself? So it's not the officer making the decision, but the technology bit. We saw that sometimes, sometimes officers were sent to a scene saying, well, you should be arresting before you even get there. That kind of taking away of discretion. So that those balances. To all the panel, really, to Bennett, to Giles, and to Alexander, in terms of those questions around the human interface, I guess, with technology. Who would like to go first?
I could
go
start.
On, Bennett.
I could start. So again, these are very very important questions. And just to add to one of the questions before I answer is, we see, of course, this conflict between, on the one hand, ever better machine learning models, right? So take machine learning now simply as we learn from data, right? And we know the state-of-the-art models, so that perform best on certain tasks, right? They are the models that are the less transparent and that are the least auditable methods, right? So we have the dilemma almost. We have these tools that are becoming better and better and better at doing what they're supposed to do. At the same time, we all the time sacrifice in transparency, right? So one of these approaches is neural networks, inspired by how we think the human brain works, right? But researchers working on it, and some of the research that I do, we are honest, and we have to say we have no idea how the algorithm makes a decision, right? It's simply, we can't tell you, right? Ironically, we now see a new scientific discipline emerging, which calls itself machine behavior, which says, let us study the algorithms, same as we used to study humans in the sort of behaviorist tradition, where humans were treated as the black box, right? And we manipulate some stimulus you see, and we see how this affects your behavior. And now people start to use the same method with algorithms. So there's really a need for understanding them. I would, to answer the two of these questions maybe together, I would say without having this auditable element in it, it is really, really hard to justify why we should use these methods, right? Because we see, you could even say, well, if they're always right, let's not care about it, right? But the problem is, we see, even with the basic method, they are not always right. They are biased. They are full with sampling issues when we generate the data that the model learns from. Alexander has nicely outlined this, that if you feed a model with crappy data, the model will never be able to correct for that. It just can't do that, right? Even worse, it will probably learn more and more and more to be biased and only target specific communities or something like this, right? So we have to really be aware of it. And I think without having this auditable element in it, that luckily I would say is, for example, implemented in the AlgoCare framework. Without doing it, I can't see how we would ever justify the use of that.
Thank you, Bennett. Alexander, you're going to come in, and then Giles?
Yeah, just a couple of additional points. So in our report that we published last year, one of the main comments that we made was that the level of explainability required will vary depending on the context. So if you are making a decision related to, sentencing or a decision that's likely to have a significant impact on an individual in the criminal justice system, you'll need a high degree of transparency in terms of the factors that were taken into account to make that decision. And indeed, administrative law principles around fair decision-making dictate that it is a legal requirement that a public body like the police service have to give a fair and clear explanation as to why certain decisions were made. I think there's an important distinction here to be made between technical transparency of a statistical model and then accountability of decision-making and transparency of decision-making, because Giles mentioned the national decision model, and it is a requirement of every member of the police service that the decisions that they make have to be defensible and accountable, and they need to be able to explain their decision-making process. Now, the use of AI tools doesn't necessarily change that fundamental principle. These tools, where we've seen them being used, are generally used to enhance the decision-making process rather than replace it, in the sense that the output from the algorithm is one other factor for the officer to take into account when arriving at their overall decision. Police officers are trained to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty using incomplete information from various different sources, whether that be intelligence that's associated with a confidence level. The police officer knows not to take that information as truth, but to assess it in its context and to weigh it up against all other relevant contextual factors. So perhaps we should treat the output of these systems like a form of intelligence. It's imperfect, it's not truth, it's one other piece of information that may be useful for the officer when making their overall judgment, but the decision remains their own and they are accountable for it.
Thank you, Alexander. And Giles?
Just building on that decision-making process. Absolutely agree with what Bennett and Sasha have said around decision making. I think what it also highlights is there's an issue here about the skills within the policing workforce to be perhaps more critical around the output of automated tools. We've seen that, for example, with the work I referred to, the Information Commissioner's report around mobile phone extraction. People involved with the forensics world would be able to say with a great degree of certainty around how the outputs from different tools are highly dependent on a set of external circumstances, but whether the person who's receiving that report understands some of the factors associated with that and is able to make that interpretation, I think has been shown to be quite questionable. So perhaps more emphasis on decision making and understanding some of the limitations of the kind of tools that are being used. But ultimately, all of this comes down to more critical evaluation required for tools, particularly ones that are going to have significant impacts on individuals.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions. One has been a couple of them have been directed to Bennett, but there's also other questions I'm going to group into this that Alexandra and Giles might be interested in answering. The first one was directed to Bennett in saying, how does the funding use for the evaluation tool in terms of funding that, and also the Home Office Scientific Development Branch had a benchmarking program for evaluating commercial video analytics software. Would you recommend a similar approach for predictive policing software? And there's a couple of other questions around some of the exclusion measures. So one question was, it's quite an interesting one, this one. I'm interested in the views of the panel on exclusion of measures from an algorithmic forecasting tool. For example, age, race, gender, proxy measures such as fate or postcode. A tool would become less accurate with unacceptable (brackets correctly) criteria excluded. So it'd be less accurate, the criteria excluded, but this will result in missed crime prevention opportunities. There appears to be a trade-off between a Kantian perspective and a utilitarian perspective. Do you see more discussion to this area at the margins where harm can be prevented, can be demonstrated to be very substantial? It feels a bit like a minefield. And then the second question also related to this is, how accurate are the algorithms used to identify gangs? Research shows that BAME are more affected by it. Why is this happening? So can I invite you to comment first, Ben, particularly on those areas around funding and benchmarking? And then anybody can just jump in with any responses after that, I think.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. So how that funding could work, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, it's about how that sort of independent tool evaluation could be funded. I think it can be as simple as, if you as a police officer responsible for that, or even on a higher level in the organization, if you see this come along, that you say, well, actually, we need independent evaluation, and that you reach out to people in the academic community, that you say, reach out to someone you know and say, can you take a look on this? But that, of course, requires that you know someone that is actually working in that area of expertise, right? Because for example, I would be comfortable evaluating some machine learning models that are based on text, right? But like object recognition is not at all my area, right? So I would say, look, this is not what I'm good at. So if there's more, if this is something that more police forces would want to do, I think it is worth thinking about maybe establishing a sort of group of researchers that say, look, we are there to do this, right? We are the go-to resource that you can contact, right? They're the first point of contact that then says, okay, we have people that work on text data, on object recognition, on forecasting, on spatial temporal stuff, etc. And that then you can reach the relevant people, and that then there's a simple, easy, fast model where you say, I don't know, you commission a small piece of work, and then within a few weeks you have a recommendation report, right? Because obviously we're not talking about a year-long review project that we academics like to do.
Yeah, can I come in there?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Bennett. At the moment, we've got a very piecemeal approach to any of this kind of evaluation. It tends to be one-off, which means it's time-consuming. It's probably very expensive. So I think there's great merit in the idea of having that more systematic approach. And this is where really there's a need for better national coordination around these, so that you're not having individual police forces kind of going off having to kind of navigate these waters on their own, but they've got some reliable source of external expertise. You can't expect police forces to have this kind of level of assurance expertise in-house, but it would be entirely possible for it to be accessible on some kind of national framework. So it's doable if there's a will to work in that way. I've got a comment also on the later point around gangs and disproportionality. But,
yeah, good.
so I think one of the issues in policing generally is about the framing of problems and requirements. And the gangs matrix is an absolute classic case study in this. Because if you decide that the problem is gangs, then by definition you're almost you're going to do something that creates disproportionality issues, because you've already decided that your problem is dealing with a certain subset of society, in this case young black men, and then you're going to build some system that basically profiles and targets young black men, and all the issues that came from the Met gangs matrix were entirely kind of foreseeable on that basis. So there's a question here about the framing of the problem in the first place, which is not really a technical issue. It's much more at the initial kind of scoping and requirements level, and that's where I feel in policing there's often insufficient attention into actually really being rigorous about saying, is this a problem that is we've got a clear idea what the problem is, and is it something that where there is a potential technology solution to this problem? We often jump to we've got a solution and then fit the problem around the solution rather than the other way around. So that issue around problem framing and actually making those requirements more robust is I think a core requirement, certainly for more senior leaders who are often in charge of these kind of things, to ask those kind of challenging questions at the outset.
Yeah,
thank you, Charles.
Can I just pick up on a couple of points? So I completely echo Giles's point around how the problem is framed, and I think there's, from my experience based on the projects that we've looked at, this type of technology adds far more value when it's used to produce kind of strategic insights rather than individual level predictions about future behavior. It's one thing to be saying, oh, we want to predict which individuals are most likely to commit a serious violence offence over the next year, and then we're going to target those particular individuals with interventions. It's a very different proposition to be saying, we want to use that same data and that same modelling in order to understand the drivers behind serious violence in our community, and what are the factors that lead individuals to commit serious violence. You're not doing individual level behavioural profiling, but you are still trying to understand what are the factors that lead to it. And I just want to go back to the question around including those demographic variables in your statistical model. The Equality Act provides protection around protected characteristics. So it is unlawful for a public body to discriminate against somebody based on protected characteristics. So if you were using that algorithm in a way that it was likely to result in interventions being taken against particular individuals, you would have to demonstrate that those interventions were not being taken on the basis of a protected characteristic. But again, there are circumstances in which you would want to understand, okay, let's model our data to understand the disproportionate elements of how crime is distributed in our community. So in what way do aspects like socio-demographic factors interact with crime rates in our local community, so we can address those underlying disparities? That is perfectly legitimate if it's not being used in a way that then targets minority groups with what would be described as less favorable treatment from an equalities perspective.
Thank you for that. Really useful in the sense of how this technology is used, and you could kind of see very kind of stark differences between that kind of left realism kind of policy, the right realism, zero tolerance policing extremes, where policy can be implemented in many ways. I'm reminded of Ben Bowling's article about zero tolerance policing in New York and how it's rather aggressive style of policing that wasn't particularly democratic and for all the people, and that some of the reductions in crime were put to the model when it was more about the kind of drugs market there. So, I think those kind of issues are really important in police in terms of how that knowledge is used. I've got one final question, which is a really interesting one. It says, thanks to all the presenters for today's presentations, and so the huge thank you on the behalf of this particular person. They said, do you feel that better representation of gender and ethnicities in your field could lead to improvements in the quality of decisions around the implementation of new technologies or their audit for bias and other risks? So, I think we've seen, in terms of recruitment, particularly in the police, that the recruitment hasn't happened in terms of proportion to gender or ethnicity, and that there's arguments around if you do improve representation of gender and ethnicity, that decision-making engagement with the public improves. Along those lines, I was wondering if you could give your views to that question.
In short, yes. I think the question's a polite way of saying why are we all white men, which is an absolutely fair challenge. And I think we know policing's got a diversity and inclusion challenge. There's lots of evidence about that, and we also know that technology's got a diversity and inclusion challenge as well. And put the two things together, and they could have a kind of compounding effect. So I think it's a very thoughtful challenge, and one that I think certainly leaders in policing would do well to kind of reflect on some of the risks around that, because there's a real danger in exacerbating underlying inequalities through the adoption of technology that isn't robustly evaluated.
Thank you.
I could add a sentence here as well. So one thing to add from the different perspective, why I think we need more diversity also in the development of the technology is, so there's recently been, and I'll keep it short given time, but there's recently been massive outcry publicly on Google firing their team of their AI ethics, people of their AI ethics group, right? And really the long story short there is there were people within the organization that were saying, well, we built these massive language models that not only learn how to interpret language, but then also learn how to generate language, right? This is how chatbots work. Google search is based on that. So really a big part of the internet uses these language models, right? And they were essentially saying in that paper, which was then the reason why that person was fired down the line, but they were really arguing, saying, well, in using that, look at what we do. We are relying on data that is online. We are relying on text data that is online. So by definition, we exclude languages or countries where internet connection is not really good, that are not online for that many years, for example, right? We fully ignore the non-English speaking part, although there are some developments there. But they are saying, if we push this further, right, we are creating this view of the world and how the internet works and how language on the internet is, that is exclusively based on the European American kind of content, thoughts that are shared, right? So it can have dramatic implications, right? And if you then apply this to, say, policing context, and then want to understand, use computational models to understand language in certain domains, yeah, the models will fail, right? Because the models think language is how European and American people express themselves verbally, right? So even in the technology itself, we need the diversity, and therefore also in the teams, right? Because not only will we need people to challenge the ideas that are going on, right? We need people to say, well, actually, the way you do it is not the good way.
Yeah. Thank you, Bennett. Right. Okay, I think what we'll do, we'll call it, that's going to be our last question now. We've come to time, it's 4 o'clock now. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our panel, Giles, Bennett and Alexander, for fantastic 3 papers. Really complemented each other well, and I think has really articulated well the challenges of police use of these technologies, and there's been a really good debate. And thank you for everybody for attending and putting forward your questions. They were really carefully considered and really got some interesting responses. And finally, I also like to thank Paul McFarlane, Julia Jesberg and Ben Bradford, who together with myself, we put the series together, and would really hope more of you come to the next series, that the next event that'll be coming up shortly. You'll see the information out there, and we hope to see you shortly with some more interesting papers online. So thanks again to our panel. Our gratitude for you for coming and preparing and presenting your papers today. They've been really well received and enjoyed. So